All right, so are you ready for this one? We're going to deep dive into something pretty controversial today. Pete Hegseth as the nominee for Secretary of Defense. I mean, wow, what a pick. We've got a ton of sources to work with today, articles, interviews, even some of Hegseth's own words from places like the American Presidency Project and Vanity Fair, and even a pretty interesting reaction quote from Politico.
Yeah, this nomination has definitely raised some eyebrows. I think what's really fascinating here is that the Secretary of Defense isn't just any cabinet position. This is the person who shapes military policy and advises the president on matters of war and peace, decisions with global consequences.
Exactly. Global consequences for sure. So to really understand what a Hegseth-led Pentagon might look like, I think we have to understand the guy himself. So where do we start with his background?
Well, his military service is a natural starting point. Hegseth served as an Army National Guard officer, with deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. He earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Combat Infantryman badge, and even spent time as a platoon leader at Guantanamo Bay.
So a solid military background. But then things take a pretty interesting turn, right?
Yeah, he kind of shifts gears, becomes a prominent conservative activist. Hegseth takes the helm of Vets for Freedom and Concerned Veterans for America. Now, that second organization has ties to the Koch brothers and advocates for limited government involvement, especially when it comes to veterans issues.
Got it. So I've got the military background, then we've got the conservative activism, and then comes the media part. He joins Fox News in 2014, becomes a co-host of Fox and Friends Weekend, and just cements his image as a strong conservative voice.
Right, and a very strong supporter of Donald Trump. I think it's super important to remember that this isn't just any president appointing him. It's a president with whom he shares a strong personal and ideological alignment.
Okay, so I got to ask, how much of Hegseth's appeal to Trump is about personal loyalty versus shared ideology?
That's a good question. I think it's probably a mix of both. But their shared ideology is definitely significant, even before this nomination. There were reports that Hegseth was advising Trump on military matters, even advocating for pardons of service members accused of war crimes.
Advocating for those pardons is a pretty big deal. What does that tell us about his approach to military justice and accountability?
It could suggest that he might prioritize loyalty and a certain vision of military strength over strict adherence to traditional norms of accountability. Is definitely something that has a lot of people worried, particularly within the defense community.
And yeah, speaking of those concerns, some of the reactions from national security officials and defense analysts have been, well, let's just say colorful. Politico even quoted one industry lobbyist asking, "Who the flunk is this guy?" I can only imagine the shockwaves this nomination sent through the Pentagon.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, we're talking about someone who has never held a high-level government position, let alone one with such complex national security implications. His background is so different from the typical defense secretary. Seasoned politicians, former generals, people with a deep understanding of policymaking. This is a huge departure from the norm.
All right, so let's get into it. What kind of changes are we potentially talking about with a Hegseth-led Pentagon? I mean, the sources paint a pretty dramatic picture, don't they?
They do. It seems like one of Hegseth's biggest priorities, based on what he's said and done in the past, is to eliminate what he calls woke ideologies from the military. He sees things like diversity initiatives as distractions from what he believes the military should focus on, warfighting.
Okay, so this woke ideology thing is interesting. Can you talk a bit more about what that actually means? What policies or initiatives does he consider woke?
Well, he's criticized things like mandatory diversity training and the use of gender-neutral language in military documents, even the presence of Pride Month displays on bases. He sees these things as symptoms of a bigger societal shift. That, he believes, weakens the military.
Interesting. He also seems to have a strong desire to replace high-ranking officials who he sees as lacking in leadership. Isn't that right, out of Trump's playbook?
Absolutely. And it raises a big question. What happens to military expertise and continuity? If all the experienced leaders are pushed out, it's something to think about. This potential brain drain. It could have serious repercussions for the military's readiness and ability to respond to crises.
So we've got this unconventional background, a strong relationship with Trump, and a clear desire to shake things up. So how does all of this translate to actually running the Pentagon? That's where things get really interesting.
Exactly. Hegseth's priorities suggest a very specific vision for the military, a vision that puts traditional values first. That focuses on warfighting prowess and rejects what he sees as too much social progressivism.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about potential changes to the entire military, like from the people to the policies. So what might some of those changes actually look like?
Well, based on Hegseth's past statements and writings, there are a few things we might see, like maybe he reinstates the transgender troop ban. He's hinted at that
Yeah.
before. We might also see changes to abortion travel policies for service members,
Sure.
and maybe even changes to base names that have been controversial.
Wow, those are some pretty big changes. What about America's global role, like troop deployments and things like that? How could those be affected?
Well, Hegseth has said he supports withdrawing troops from Germany, which aligns with what Trump wanted to do. And has also been pretty critical of NATO, which has been a core part of U.S. foreign policy for decades. So yeah, those are definitely things to watch.
So it sounds like a Hegseth-led Pentagon could mean a more isolationist America, less involved in global alliances.
Yeah, that's a real possibility. And it raises some serious questions. Like, would this actually make things more stable? Or would it increase tensions with countries like China or Iran? I think these are questions that a lot of experts and policymakers are going to be thinking about.
And it's not just about international relations. We also have to think about the impact on the troops themselves, the people he'd be leading. How might all of this play out for them?
That's a super important point. Hegseth says that his reforms would make the military stronger by building a culture of meritocracy and focusing on fighting wars effectively. But critics worry about what it could do to morale, especially among minority groups and people he's targeted with his rhetoric.
You mentioned meritocracy, but some people say his policies would actually limit opportunities for advancement based on merit, not enhance them. What do you think about that?
That's a valid concern that some of his ideas, especially about diversity and inclusion, could be seen as creating barriers for certain groups. It really depends on how those policies are actually implemented and what the real focus is. If it's only about traditional combat effectiveness, then yeah, it could hurt some individuals. But if the goal is to create a truly meritocratic system, one that recognizes and rewards a wider range of skills and talents, then the outcome could be totally different.
So to really understand all of this, I think we need to go beyond his resume and the reactions and hear him in his own words, like the quotes from his book and interviews. They give us a glimpse into his worldview, his philosophy for changing the military.
Absolutely. Those quotes can be really insightful. For example, there's one from his book that I think sums up his whole approach. He says, "Peace through strength works, but the flip side is war invited by weakness." It shows how much he believes in a strong military presence globally.
And he's not afraid to criticize what he sees as the politicization of the military.
Nope, not at all, he said. Political correctness is a poison to our security and defenses. He thinks initiatives focused on diversity and inclusion distract from warfighting.
And then there's that really famous quote, "The dumbest phrase on planet Earth in the military is, 'Our diversity is our strength.'" It's a bold statement for sure.
It is. He seems to believe that focusing on diversity actually undermines meritocracy and weakens the military. It's definitely sparked a lot of debate, and it would definitely influence his actions as Secretary of Defense.
But some might say that a more diverse military is better equipped to handle modern warfare, to understand and engage with different cultures and populations.
Yeah, that's a good point. A more diverse force could bring more perspectives and experiences, which can be really helpful in today's world.
So zooming out a bit, what does all of this mean for the future of the U.S. military? What kind of military does Hegseth want, and how would that vision play out on the world stage?
Well, it's clear he wants a military focused on traditional values and fighting wars. A military that's not so concerned with what he sees as social engineering, and more focused on projecting strength and dominance. How that would actually play out globally is hard to say. It could lead to a more assertive, maybe even more aggressive U.S. foreign policy.
I have a feeling his confirmation hearings are going to be must-watch TV. Senators from both sides will want to talk about his qualifications, but also about the future of the military in the 21st century. These hearings could become a flashpoint for discussions about America's role in the world, about military priorities, and about the relationship between the military and civilian society.
Oh, for sure. This nomination is going to be a lightning rod. It's going to force some really important conversations about the kind of military America wants and needs in the years to come.
I mean, it really feels like we're at a crossroads, not just for the military, but for America's role in the world. What does it say about us as a country if we go down this path?
That is the question, isn't it? This isn't just about one person or one job. Hegseth's nomination represents a fundamental shift in how America sees itself and its place in the world.
Yeah, we've talked about his background, his priorities, his own words. But it seems like the big question is, what kind of military does America want in the 21st century?
It's a big question. It's easy to get caught up in the politics and the controversy. But we need to think long term here. This isn't just a 4-year thing. This is about the future of the most powerful military in the world.
Right. And that future, it's going to have a huge impact on everything from our relationships with allies to our strategies for dealing with our enemies to how we see ourselves as a nation.
Okay. I think it's really helpful to look at this historically. Maybe take some time to explore the history of civilian control of the military in the U.S. Think about how past presidents have handled this balance of power. What worked, what didn't, what were the risks?
That's a great idea. I'd also say try to get different perspectives on Hegseth and what his impact might be. Read what his supporters are saying, what his critics are saying. Don't just stick with one side. Challenge yourself to really understand what's at stake here.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, critical thinking is so important, especially these days with so much information flying around. Don't just accept everything you hear. Question your assumptions. Think about different points of view. Weigh the evidence.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, but it doesn't end here. The future of the U.S. military and its role in the world. It's something we all have a part in. So keep learning, keep asking questions, keep thinking critically.
Because the choices we make today about the military and so much more, they're going to shape the world for generations to come. It's up to all of us to have these conversations.
Right.
And to work towards a future where the military's power is used wisely and responsibly.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today, but thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And as always, keep questioning everything.